In the opulent drawing rooms of Regency England, where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, and marriages were mere transactions between powerful families, one reckless wager would shatter the carefully constructed world of high society. When the arrogant Duke of Ashworth accepted a cruel bet involving the kingdom's most overlooked woman, he believed he was claiming an easy victory. Little did he know that beneath her modest exterior lay secrets that would make him the most envied or most foolish man in all of England. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has travelled. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ashworth Manor as Sebastian Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, lounged in his leather chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known want. At 28, he possessed the kind of devastating handsomeness that had made him the most sought-after bachelor in London. Dark hair that caught the firelight, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through every deception except his own, and a smile that could charm a fortune from a miser's purse. "Another £1,000 on the next hand, Ashworth." Lord Pemberton's voice carried across the smoke-filled study, where England's most privileged sons gathered weekly to gamble away what their tenants could never hope to earn in a lifetime. Sebastian's fingers drummed against his brandy glass, the amber liquid catching the light like liquid gold. "Make it 2,000, Pemberton. I'm feeling particularly fortunate tonight." The other men chuckled, but there was an edge to their laughter. Sebastian's luck at cards was legendary, matched only by his reputation for ruthless business dealings and his complete disregard for anyone he deemed beneath his station. He had inherited not only one of England's oldest dukedoms, but also a fortune so vast that even he had stopped counting the zeros. "Speaking of fortune," drawled Lord Whitmore, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his stupidity, "have you seen the Hartwell chit lately? Poor creature grows more unfortunate looking by the season." Sebastian barely glanced up from his cards. Lady Eleanor Hartwell was a name whispered in drawing rooms with a mixture of pity and disdain. The daughter of a minor baron, she was known throughout London society as the woman no man would ever want. Plain, bookish, and possessed of an unfortunate tendency to speak her mind on subjects ladies were supposed to ignore. "I heard her father's been trying to arrange a match for 3 seasons now," Pemberton added with a sneer. "Not a single offer. Can you imagine being so desperate?" "Perhaps we should start a betting pool," Whitmore suggested, his eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "Who among us could stomach marriage to such a creature?" The room fell silent, except for the crackling fire and the steady patter of rain. Sebastian looked up slowly, his blue eyes cold as winter frost. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting, Whitmore? A wager, Your Grace, the ultimate test of a gentleman's fortitude." Whitmore's smile was sharp as a blade. £10,000 says not even the great Duke of Ashworth could bring himself to marry the Hartwell girl. The other men leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Sebastian's reputation for accepting any challenge was as well known as his fortune. He had once raced his stallion through Hyde Park at midnight for a mere £100 and had bought an entire shipping company simply because someone suggested he couldn't afford it. 10,000. Sebastian's voice was dangerously quiet. "You insult me, Whitmore. Make it 20,000, and I'll not only marry the girl, I'll make her fall in love with me in the process." The room erupted in nervous laughter and excited murmurs. Bets were placed, hands were shaken, and Sebastian found himself committed to the most expensive wager of his life. As the evening wore on and the other men departed into the rain-soaked London night, Sebastian remained in his chair, staring into the dying fire. He had seen Eleanor Hartwell exactly twice, once at Lady Pemberton's ball, where she had sat alone in a corner with a book, and once at the opera where she had been more interested in the music than the social maneuvering happening in the boxes around her. Both times he had dismissed her as thoroughly unremarkable, plain brown hair, unremarkable brown eyes, and a figure hidden beneath unfashionable gowns that seemed designed to repel rather than attract. What Sebastian didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Eleanor Hartwell possessed something far more valuable than beauty. Hidden away in the modest Hartwell townhouse were documents that would make her the wealthiest woman in England. If only she knew they existed. Her late mother's family had left her an inheritance so vast it dwarfed even Sebastian's fortune. But the lawyers had been waiting for her 25th birthday to reveal the truth. That birthday was only 3 weeks away. As Sebastian finally rose from his chair and made his way to his opulent bedchamber, he was already planning his campaign. How difficult could it be to charm one plain, desperate spinster? He would court her with just enough attention to secure her affections, marry her quickly before she could reconsider, and then, well, then he would be £20,000 richer and could quietly install her in one of his country estates while he continued his life in London. The Duke of Ashworth fell asleep that night with a satisfied smile on his lips, completely unaware that he was about to become the most foolish man in all of England. For in 3 weeks' time, when Eleanor Hartwell learned the truth about her inheritance, she would become the one woman in the kingdom who could buy and sell him 10 times over. But first, she would have to survive the most humiliating courtship of her life, never knowing that the man pursuing her saw her as nothing more than a means to win a bet. The question that would soon set all of London ablaze was simple. Who was truly the hunter, and who was the prey? The morning after his fateful wager, Sebastian Blackwood stood before his gilt-framed mirror, while his valet, Morrison, adjusted his perfectly tailored morning coat. The reflection that stared back at him was that of a man supremely confident in his own superiority. Every line of his aristocratic features spoke of generations of breeding and privilege. "Send word to Lady Pemberton," Sebastian commanded, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. "Inform her that I shall be attending her garden party this afternoon. And Morrison, ensure my appearance is particularly striking today." Morrison, who had served the Blackwood family for 30 years, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He had learned long ago that his master's whims were not to be questioned, no matter how peculiar they might seem. The Pemberton estate buzzed with the excited chatter of London's elite as Sebastian's magnificent black carriage rolled up the circular drive. Lady Pemberton herself rushed to greet him, her face flushed with the triumph of securing the season's most coveted guest. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure," she gushed, her feathers practically quivering with excitement. "I do hope you'll find our little gathering entertaining." Sebastian's eyes swept across the manicured gardens where England's most privileged daughters paraded in their finest gowns, each hoping to catch his attention. But his gaze was searching for someone else entirely, someone who would be easy to overlook among such peacocks. He found Eleanor Hartwell exactly where he expected, seated alone beneath an ancient oak tree, a leather-bound volume of poetry open in her lap. She wore a simple dress of pale green muslin that, while well-made, lacked the elaborate embellishments favored by her contemporaries. Her brown hair was arranged in a modest style that framed a face that, Sebastian noted with surprise, was far from the hideous visage society had led him to expect. Eleanor was, in truth, quietly lovely in a way that required a second glance to appreciate. Her features were delicate and intelligent, her brown eyes warm with an inner light that spoke of deep thoughts and genuine feeling. But in a world that valued flash over substance, her understated beauty had been overlooked by men seeking more obvious attractions. "Miss Hartwell," Sebastian approached with the predatory grace of a wolf in sheep's clothing, his most charming smile firmly in place. How delightful to find someone who appreciates literature at such a gathering. Eleanor looked up, startled. The Duke of Ashworth was speaking to her, the same man who had never so much as acknowledged her existence in 3 seasons of shared social events. Her heart fluttered traitorously, even as her mind warned her to be cautious. "Your Grace," she replied, rising gracefully and offering a small curtsy. "I confess I find the poetry more engaging than the gossip." A woman of discerning taste," Sebastian said, noting how her voice carried a musical quality that was surprisingly pleasant. "Might I join you? I find myself in need of intelligent conversation." For the next hour, Sebastian deployed every weapon in his considerable arsenal of charm. He listened attentively as Eleanor spoke about her favorite authors, nodded thoughtfully at her observations about society, and even managed to appear genuinely interested in her opinions on subjects ranging from politics to philosophy. Eleanor, starved for intellectual companionship and genuine attention, found herself blooming under his focused regard. For the first time in her life, a man was treating her as if her thoughts mattered, as if she were worthy of serious consideration. The lonely girl, who had spent countless evenings watching other women dance while she sat with the chaperones, began to hope that perhaps her fortune was finally changing. "Miss Hartwell," Sebastian said as the afternoon drew to a close, "I wonder if you might permit me to call upon you tomorrow. I find our conversation has been the highlight of my day." Eleanor's cheeks flushed pink with pleasure. Yes, Your Grace, I would be honored." As Sebastian took his leave, he caught sight of Whitmore and Pemberton watching from across the garden, their faces a mixture of amazement and grudging admiration. The great Duke of Ashworth was actually pursuing the Hartwell girl, and from all appearances she was already half in love with him. Over the following weeks, Sebastian's courtship became the talk of London. He called upon Eleanor daily, bringing her rare books and engaging her in lengthy discussions about subjects that would have bored him to tears with any other woman. He escorted her to the opera, where he made a point of being seen whispering in her ear during the performance. He even convinced her to dance with him at Lady Morrison's ball, where the sight of the kingdom's most eligible bachelor waltzing with the season's most overlooked wallflower sent shockwaves through the ballroom. Eleanor, meanwhile, was living in a dream. The man she had admired from afar for years was not only paying her attention, but seemed genuinely captivated by her company. She began to take more care with her appearance, allowing her maid to arrange her hair in more fashionable styles, and selecting gowns that, while still modest, better displayed her naturally graceful figure. "My dear," her father, Baron Hartwell, said one evening as they sat in their modest drawing-room, "I confess I am amazed by the Duke's attentions." "Are his intentions serious?" Eleanor's heart soared. "I believe they may be, Papa. He speaks of the future as if he sees me in it." What Eleanor didn't know was that Sebastian's words were carefully calculated lies, each compliment and tender gesture designed to secure her affections as quickly as possible. In his private moments, he congratulated himself on his masterful performance while counting the days until he could claim his £20,000. The climax of Sebastian's campaign came at the Duchess of Marlborough's Grand Ball, the most prestigious event of the season. Eleanor arrived wearing a gown of deep blue silk that transformed her from a quiet wallflower into a woman of understated elegance. Sebastian, resplendent in his formal evening wear, claimed her hand for the opening waltz and led her onto the floor before the assembled cream of English society. As they danced, Eleanor felt as if she were floating on air. The man of her dreams held her in his arms, his blue eyes gazing down at her with what she believed was genuine affection. Around them, the ballroom glittered with candlelight and jewels, but Eleanor saw only Sebastian's handsome face. "Miss Hartwell," Sebastian murmured as the music swelled around them, "there is something I must tell you, something that cannot wait another moment." Eleanor's breath caught. Was this the moment she had been dreaming of? Was the Duke of Ashworth about to declare himself? "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. Sebastian's smile was perfect, practiced, and completely false. My dear Eleanor, these past weeks have shown me something I never expected to discover. You have captured my heart completely. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow of pure joy. Around them, other couples continued to dance, but she felt as if the entire world had stopped to witness this perfect moment. I love you, Sebastian continued, his voice carrying just the right note of passionate sincerity, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Eleanor Hartwell, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The ballroom seemed to spin around Eleanor as tears of happiness sprang to her eyes. Yes, she breathed. Oh yes, Sebastian, yes. As Sebastian slipped his grandmother's emerald ring onto her trembling finger, the assembled guests erupted in surprised murmurs and polite applause. The Duke of Ashworth was engaged to Eleanor Hartwell, the match no one had seen coming, but everyone would be talking about for months. But even as Eleanor basked in the glow of her newfound happiness, she remained unaware of the cruel truth behind Sebastian's proposal. In exactly 1 week, on her 25th birthday, she would receive a letter from her mother's solicitors that would change everything. The inheritance that had been held in trust since her mother's death would finally be revealed, an inheritance that would make her the wealthiest unmarried woman in all of England. And Sebastian, the man who thought he was winning a bet by marrying a poor, plain spinster, was about to discover that he had just proposed to the one woman in the kingdom who could buy his precious dukedom 10 times over. The question that would soon tear through London society like wildfire was simple. When Eleanor learned the truth about both her fortune and her fiancé's motives, which revelation would prove more devastating? The morning of Eleanor's 25th birthday dawned grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens were weeping for what was about to unfold. She sat in the modest morning room of Hartwell House, her engagement ring catching what little light filtered through the rain-streaked windows, when Morrison, their elderly butler, entered with a silver tray bearing an official-looking letter. "A correspondence from Whitfield, Pemberton and Associates, miss," Morrison announced, his weathered face creased with curiosity. The law firm was one of London's most prestigious, not the sort to conduct business with the modest Hartwell household. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal, expecting perhaps some legal formality related to her upcoming marriage to Sebastian. Instead, the words that met her eyes seemed to dance and blur as their meaning slowly penetrated her consciousness. "Dear Miss Hartwell," the letter began in precise legal script, "we are pleased to inform you that upon reaching your 25th birthday, you are now entitled to claim the inheritance left to you by your late maternal grandmother, the Countess of Ravenshollow. The estate, which has been held in trust and carefully managed for the past decade, now totals approximately £400,000, along with properties in Yorkshire, Scotland and Ireland." The letter fluttered from Eleanor's nerveless fingers as the full magnitude of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. £400,000. The sum was so vast it defied comprehension, more money than most noble families possessed, more than enough to purchase entire counties. She was not merely wealthy, she was one of the richest individuals in all of England. For several minutes, Eleanor sat in stunned silence, her mind reeling with the implications. All those years of careful economy, of wearing last season's gowns and declining invitations because they couldn't afford the proper attire, all of it had been unnecessary. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 15, taking the secret of the inheritance to her grave, leaving only instructions with the solicitors to reveal the truth on Eleanor's 25th birthday. But even as the shock of her newfound wealth began to settle, a more disturbing realization crept into her consciousness. Sebastian's sudden interest in her, his whirlwind courtship, his passionate declarations of love. The timing was too convenient, too perfectly orchestrated. A man who had ignored her existence for 3 seasons had suddenly discovered her charms just weeks before she came into her inheritance. Eleanor's hands shook as she retrieved the letter from the floor, reading it again to ensure she hadn't imagined the staggering figures. No, it was all terrifyingly real. She was rich beyond her wildest dreams, and quite possibly the victim of the most calculated deception of her life. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones drew her attention to the window. Sebastian's magnificent black carriage was pulling up to their modest front door, right on schedule for their planned morning ride through Hyde Park. Eleanor watched through the rain-streaked glass as he emerged, impeccably dressed as always, his handsome face wearing the charming smile that had so thoroughly captivated her heart. "Miss Eleanor," Morrison announced, "His Grace the Duke of Ashworth has arrived." "Tell him," Eleanor began, then stopped. She needed time to think, to process this earth-shattering revelation before facing the man who might have deceived her so completely. "Tell him I am indisposed, a headache. Ask him to call again tomorrow." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. It was unlike Eleanor to refuse the Duke's company, but he bowed and departed to deliver the message. Through the window, Eleanor watched Sebastian's face change from confident expectation to surprise, then to something that might have been annoyance before he schooled his features back into polite concern. As his carriage disappeared into the London traffic, Eleanor made a decision that would change the course of her life. She needed to escape, to think clearly away from the suffocating atmosphere of London society and Sebastian's overwhelming presence. There was only one person she could trust with this devastating secret, one person who had always seen through society's pretenses with razor-sharp clarity. Lady Agatha Pembroke, Eleanor's great-aunt, lived in a grand townhouse in Bath, having retreated from London society years ago after what she called one too many encounters with human stupidity. At 65, Agatha was everything Eleanor had been taught a proper lady should not be: outspoken, independent, and possessed of a fortune she had inherited and managed entirely on her own terms. Within hours, Eleanor had packed a single trunk and was aboard the mail coach to Bath, leaving behind only a brief note for her father explaining that she needed time to consider her future. The journey gave her precious hours to think, to examine every moment of Sebastian's courtship with new, suspicious eyes. How perfectly he had played his part. The charming Duke suddenly smitten with the overlooked wallflower. How carefully he had timed his proposal, ensuring her acceptance before her birthday could reveal the truth about her circumstances. The more she analyzed his behavior, the more convinced she became that his entire courtship had been an elaborate performance. Lady Agatha's townhouse in Bath was a sanctuary of intellectual freedom and honest conversation. Unlike the rigid formality of London society, Agatha's home was filled with books, art, and the kind of stimulating discourse that Eleanor had always craved. When Eleanor arrived unannounced on her doorstep, rain-soaked and emotionally shattered, Agatha took one look at her great-niece's face and ushered her inside without a single question. "My dear child," Agatha said once Eleanor was settled before a roaring fire with a cup of strong tea, "you look as though you've seen a ghost, or perhaps discovered that someone you trusted was one." The words broke through Eleanor's carefully maintained composure, and the entire story came pouring out: the inheritance, Sebastian's sudden courtship, her growing suspicions about his motives. Agatha listened without interruption, her sharp grey eyes growing increasingly stormy as the tale unfolded. £400,000, Agatha mused when Eleanor finished. "My dear, you're not merely wealthy, you're a force of nature. And this Duke of yours—" Her voice dripped with disdain. "I've heard whispers about Sebastian Blackwood, arrogant, entitled, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having faced real consequences." "But what if I'm wrong?" Eleanor asked desperately. "What if his feelings are genuine? What if—" "Eleanor," Agatha interrupted gently but firmly, "when has your intuition ever led you astray? You've always been able to see through people's pretenses. Trust that gift now." Over the following days, Agatha helped Eleanor process not just the betrayal, but the incredible opportunity that lay before her. With her newfound wealth came freedom, the freedom to choose her own path, to live life on her own terms, to never again be dependent on anyone's approval or affection. You could travel, Agatha suggested as they walked through Bath's elegant crescents. See the world, experience cultures beyond England's shores. You could patronize the arts, support causes you believe in, make a real difference in the world. But even as Eleanor began to envision a life of independence and purpose, she couldn't entirely banish thoughts of Sebastian. Despite everything, part of her heart still hoped that she was wrong, that his feelings for her were real. It was a hope that would soon be tested in the most devastating way possible. On their third evening in Bath, as Eleanor and Agatha sat reading in the comfortable library, a knock at the door interrupted their peaceful evening. Morrison, Agatha's butler, not to be confused with the Hartwell family's servant, entered with a troubled expression. "My lady, there's a gentleman caller. Says he's the Duke of Ashworth, here to see Miss Eleanor. He seems quite agitated." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Sebastian had followed her to Bath, had somehow discovered her refuge. Through the library window, she could see his familiar figure pacing on the front steps, his usual composure clearly strained. "What would you like me to tell him, my dear?" Agatha asked, her voice carefully neutral. Eleanor took a deep breath, drawing strength from the knowledge of her newfound independence. "Tell him I'll see him, but not alone. You'll remain with us throughout the conversation." As Morrison departed to deliver the message, Agatha reached over and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Remember, my dear, you hold all the power now. He just doesn't know it yet." When Sebastian entered the library minutes later, Eleanor was struck by how different he seemed. Gone was the perfectly controlled Duke she had known in London. His dark hair was dishevelled from the journey, his usually immaculate clothing wrinkled, and his blue eyes held a wild edge she had never seen before. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with what sounded like genuine emotion. "Thank God I found you. When you disappeared without a word, I feared something terrible had happened. I needed time to think," Eleanor replied carefully, studying his face for any sign of deception. "About us. About our future." "Think about what?" Sebastian moved closer, his handsome features arranged in an expression of confused concern. "Eleanor, we're to be married. We love each other. What could possibly require such dramatic contemplation?" The word love hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eleanor felt Agatha's supportive presence beside her, drawing strength from her great-aunt's unwavering confidence. "Do we, Sebastian?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Do we truly love each other? Or is there perhaps something else motivating this sudden romance?" For just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, something flickered in Sebastian's eyes. Surprise, guilt, fear, but it was gone so quickly that Eleanor couldn't be certain what she had seen. "I don't understand," Sebastian said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Eleanor, you're frightening me. Has someone said something to poison your mind against me?" It was the perfect response. Concerned, loving, slightly wounded. If Eleanor hadn't spent the past 3 days analyzing every moment of their courtship, she might have been convinced. But now, with the clarity that distance and wealth had provided, she could see the calculation behind his words. "No one has said anything," Eleanor replied, rising from her chair with a grace that surprised even herself. "But sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Sometimes what people don't say reveals more than what they do." As she stood there, facing the man who had so thoroughly deceived her, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest. The desperate, grateful girl who had accepted his proposal was gone, replaced by a woman who finally understood her own worth. The question now was whether Sebastian would reveal his true nature, or continue the charade that had brought them to this moment. But Eleanor was no longer the same woman who had danced in his arms just days ago, and the game he thought he was playing was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The tension in Lady Agatha's library was thick enough to cut with a knife as Sebastian stared at Eleanor, his mind racing to understand what had changed. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the grateful, blushing girl who had accepted his proposal just days ago. There was something different in her posture, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before, and it unnerved him more than he cared to admit. "Eleanor," Sebastian said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had never failed to bend others to his will, "I demand to know what has brought about this sudden change in your demeanor. We are engaged to be married. You owe me an explanation." Lady Agatha's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. Eleanor felt her great-aunt's eyes upon her, offering silent support, but she knew this moment belonged to her alone. The old Eleanor would have crumbled under Sebastian's imperious demand, would have apologized and sought to placate him. But the woman who now stood before him, the woman who had discovered both her fortune and her strength, was made of sterner stuff. "I owe you nothing, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice steady and clear. "An engagement is not a contract of ownership, and I am not your possession to command." Sebastian's blue eyes flashed with something dangerous. For a moment, the charming mask slipped entirely, revealing the arrogant, entitled man beneath. "You forget yourself, Miss Hartwell. You are a baron's daughter with no fortune and no prospects. I have offered you a position that any woman in England would kill for, and you repay me with this inexplicable rebellion." The words hung in the air like a slap, and Eleanor felt the last vestiges of her romantic illusions crumble to dust. There it was, the truth she had suspected but hoped against. To Sebastian, she was nothing more than a charity case, a poor relation he was graciously elevating through marriage. "No fortune," Eleanor repeated softly, and something in her tone made Sebastian's eyes narrow with sudden wariness. "How curious that you should mention that, Your Grace. Tell me, what do you know of my financial circumstances?" "I know that your father is a minor baron with modest holdings," Sebastian replied, but there was uncertainty creeping into his voice now. "I know that you have lived quietly, without the advantages that wealth provides. I know that marriage to me would secure your future in ways you could never achieve on your own." Eleanor exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Agatha, who was watching the proceedings with the fascinated attention of someone witnessing a masterful chess match. The older woman's slight nod gave Eleanor the courage to play her hand. "How very thorough your research has been," Eleanor said, moving to stand beside the fireplace where the flames cast dancing shadows across her face. "But I'm afraid your information is somewhat outdated." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Your Grace, that as of 3 days ago, my 25th birthday to be precise, I came into an inheritance that makes me one of the wealthiest women in England." Eleanor's voice was calm, almost conversational, but her words hit Sebastian like physical blows. £400,000, along with extensive properties. "I believe that makes me considerably richer than you are." The colour drained from Sebastian's face as the implications crashed over him. Eleanor Hartwell, the poor plain spinster he had condescended to marry for a bet, was wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, wealthy enough to buy his estate 10 times over, wealthy enough to make him look like a fortune hunter. That's impossible," Sebastian stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him entirely. "If you had such wealth, why would you live so modestly? Why would your father—" "Because neither of us knew," Eleanor interrupted. "The inheritance was held in trust until my 25th birthday. My mother died without telling us of its existence." She paused, studying Sebastian's stricken face with something approaching pity. "Rather inconvenient timing for your purposes, wouldn't you say?" Sebastian's mind was reeling, trying to process this catastrophic turn of events. The bet. Dear God, the bet. £20,000 had seemed like easy money when he thought he was marrying a penniless nobody. But now he looked like exactly what he was. A fortune hunter who had targeted what he believed to be a vulnerable woman. "Eleanor," he began desperately, You must understand, my feelings for you have nothing to do with money. I fell in love with your mind, your spirit. Did you? Eleanor's voice cut through his protestations like a blade. How fascinating, because I've been wondering about the timing of your sudden interest in me. 3 seasons you ignored my existence, Sebastian. 3 years of shared social events where you never once acknowledged me, and then, just weeks before my 25th birthday, you discovered my irresistible charms. Lady Agatha made a soft sound that might have been approval, but Sebastian was too focused on the disaster unfolding before him to notice. Eleanor's transformation was complete now. Gone was any trace of the uncertain girl he had manipulated so easily. In her place stood a woman of formidable intelligence and newfound confidence, and she was dissecting his deception with surgical precision. "You're being unreasonable," Sebastian tried, falling back on the tactics that had always worked with other women. "Love doesn't follow a schedule, Eleanor. Sometimes it takes time to recognize what has been there all along." "What has been there all along?" Eleanor's laugh was soft, but utterly without humor. "My plain face, my unfashionable gowns, my tendency to speak my mind on subjects ladies aren't supposed to understand. Which of these suddenly became irresistible to you, Your Grace?" Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Every argument he might have made sounded hollow even to his own ears. The truth was written in the very timing of his courtship, in the calculated nature of his pursuit, in the way he had rushed her to accept his proposal. "I think," Lady Agatha said quietly, speaking for the first time since Sebastian's arrival, "that my great niece has heard quite enough of your explanations, Your Grace. Perhaps it would be best if you took your leave." Sebastian's eyes flashed with fury at being dismissed by a woman, but he was in no position to protest. The ground had shifted beneath his feet so completely that he felt as though he were drowning. "Eleanor, please, don't let pride destroy what we have together." "What we have together?" Eleanor moved closer to him, and Sebastian was startled to see not heartbreak in her eyes, but something that looked remarkably like pity. "We have nothing together, Sebastian. We never did. You saw a lonely, grateful girl who would be easy to manipulate, and I saw a handsome prince who might rescue me from my ordinary life. We were both chasing illusions. But the engagement will be broken," Eleanor said firmly. "I'll ensure that the announcement appears in tomorrow's papers, along with a statement that the decision was mutual and amicable. Your reputation will remain intact." Sebastian stared at her. This woman who had somehow transformed from victim to victor in the space of a few days. "And if I refuse to agree to this mutual decision?" Eleanor's smile was sharp as winter frost. "Then I suppose London society will be treated to a very interesting story about a duke who proposed to a woman he believed to be penniless, only to discover she could buy his estate 10 times over. I imagine the betting books at White's would find that quite entertaining." The threat hit its mark. Sebastian's face went white as he realized the impossible position he was in. If he fought the broken engagement, Eleanor could destroy his reputation with a few well-chosen words. If he agreed to it, he would lose both the bet and any chance of claiming her fortune. "You've changed," he said finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I have. I've discovered what I'm worth, in every sense of the word. And I've learned that a woman with means need never settle for a man who sees her as a convenience rather than a treasure." Sebastian looked as though he might say something more, but Lady Agatha rose from her chair with the unmistakable air of a woman ending an audience. "Morrison will see you out, Your Grace. I trust you can find your way back to London without difficulty." As Sebastian was escorted from the library, Eleanor sank into her chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. The confrontation had taken every ounce of her newfound strength, but she had emerged victorious. She was free of Sebastian's deception, free of society's expectations, free to forge her own path. "Well done, my dear," Lady Agatha said softly, settling back into her chair. though I suspect this is only the beginning of your transformation." Eleanor nodded, her mind already turning to the future. She had wealth, independence, and for the first time in her life, the confidence to use both. London society had dismissed her as a plain, unremarkable spinster, but they were about to discover just how wrong they had been. But first, there was the matter of Sebastian's friends, the men who had undoubtedly been party to whatever cruel game had led to his pursuit of her. Eleanor's eyes hardened as she thought of Lord Whitmore and Lord Pemberton, probably even now congratulating themselves on their clever manipulation of the desperate Hartwell girl. They had no idea that their victim was about to become their greatest threat, and that the woman they had dismissed as powerless now held enough influence to destroy them all. The question was no longer whether Eleanor would have her revenge, but how thoroughly she would choose to claim it. The game was far from over. It was just beginning, and this time Eleanor Hartwell would be the one setting the rules. The morning after Sebastian's humiliating departure from Bath, Eleanor stood at the window of Lady Agatha's drawing room, watching the early mist rise from the elegant Georgian crescents below. For the first time in days, she felt truly at peace. The weight of deception had been lifted from her shoulders, and in its place was something she had never experienced before, the intoxicating freedom of absolute independence. "The announcement has been sent to the Times," Lady Agatha announced, entering the room with a satisfied expression. "By tomorrow morning, all of London will know that the engagement between Miss Eleanor Hartwell and the Duke of Ashworth has been dissolved by mutual consent due to irreconcilable differences." Eleanor turned from the window, a small smile playing at her lips. "I imagine Sebastian is having a rather unpleasant morning explaining the situation to his friends." "Indeed," Agatha replied with obvious relish, "though I suspect his discomfort is only beginning. Word of your inheritance will spread quickly once you return to London, and society will draw its own conclusions about the timing of his courtship." But Eleanor's mind was already moving beyond thoughts of Sebastian and his humiliation. The past week had shown her something profound about herself, that beneath the quiet, overlooked exterior she had cultivated for so long lay a woman of considerable strength and intelligence. Now, with the means to support her independence, she was eager to discover what else she might be capable of. "Aunt Agatha," Eleanor said, settling into the chair beside her great-aunt, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding travel and patronage. I believe I should like to see something of the world before I decide how to use my fortune." Agatha's eyes sparkled with approval. "An excellent notion, my dear. Where would you like to begin?" "Italy," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "I've always dreamed of seeing the art galleries of Florence, the canals of Venice, the ancient ruins of Rome. And perhaps I might establish a foundation to support female artists and writers who lack the means to pursue their talents." "A worthy cause," Agatha agreed, "and one that will certainly raise eyebrows among the gentlemen who believe women's minds are too delicate for serious artistic endeavour." Their conversation was interrupted by Morrison's entrance with the Morning Post. Among the usual correspondence was a letter bearing the seal of Whitfield, Pemberton and Associates, Eleanor's solicitors. "More details about the inheritance, I expect," Eleanor murmured, breaking the seal. But as she read the contents, her expression grew increasingly amazed. "What is it, my dear?" Agatha asked, noting Eleanor's stunned silence. "It appears," Eleanor said slowly, "that my inheritance is even more substantial than originally reported. The solicitors have completed their full accounting, and the total comes to nearly £600,000, not 400. Additionally, there are investments in shipping companies, textile mills, and—" She paused, her eyes widening. "And a controlling interest in several London newspapers." Agatha's eyebrows rose sharply. "Newspapers? My dear child, do you realize what this means? You don't just have wealth, you have influence, the power to shape public opinion, to expose corruption, to champion causes that matter to you." Eleanor felt a thrill of possibility course through her veins. She had spent her entire life being dismissed and overlooked, but now she possessed the means to ensure that other women would never suffer the same fate. The newspapers alone gave her a platform that most reformers could only dream of. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that it's time I return to London, but not as the same woman who left." Over the following days, Eleanor and Lady Agatha planned her transformation with military precision. New gowns were commissioned from Bath's finest modiste, not the modest, self-effacing styles Eleanor had always worn, but elegant creations that showcased her natural grace and intelligence. A lady's maid was hired, along with a small but efficient household staff. Most importantly, Eleanor began studying the business reports from her various investments, determined to understand every aspect of her newfound empire. When Eleanor's carriage finally rolled through the gates of London a week later, she bore little resemblance to the uncertain girl who had fled the city in confusion and heartbreak. Her new wardrobe was a masterpiece of understated elegance, rich fabrics in jewel tones that complemented her coloring, cut in styles that emphasized her naturally graceful figure. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated style that framed her face beautifully, and her bearing radiated the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. But the most dramatic change was in Eleanor herself. Gone was the apologetic posture, the tendency to fade into the background, the desperate gratitude for any attention. In its place was a woman of unmistakable authority, someone who commanded respect rather than begging for it. Eleanor's first stop was not her father's modest townhouse, but rather the offices of the London Herald, one of the newspapers she now owned. The editor, Mr. James Whitfield, a distant relation of her solicitors, was a progressive-minded man who had been chafing under the previous owner's conservative restrictions. "Miss Hartwell," Whitfield said, rising from behind his cluttered desk as Eleanor was announced. "I confess I was surprised to receive your message. I had no idea the new owner was—" "A woman?" Eleanor finished with an amused smile. "Yes, I imagine that comes as quite a shock, but I assure you, Mr. Whitfield, I have every intention of taking an active role in the paper's direction." Over the next hour, Eleanor outlined her vision for the London Herald: investigative journalism that exposed social injustices, coverage of women's issues that other papers ignored, and a commitment to truth over sensationalism. Whitfield listened with growing excitement, recognizing in this unexpected proprietor a kindred spirit who shared his passion for meaningful journalism. "There is one story," Eleanor said as their meeting drew to a close, "that I believe deserves immediate attention. The practice of wealthy men making bets on the romantic prospects of vulnerable women. I think our readers would be fascinated to learn how common such cruel wagers have become among London's elite." Whitfield's eyes sharpened with professional interest. "Do you have specific information about such practices, Miss Hartwell?" "I have first-hand knowledge," Eleanor replied calmly. "And I believe it's time the public learned exactly what passes for entertainment among certain members of the aristocracy." As Eleanor left the Herald offices, she felt a deep satisfaction at the thought of Sebastian and his friends reading about their cruel games in the morning paper. But her revenge would be far more sophisticated than mere public embarrassment. She intended to use her newfound power to ensure that no other woman would ever be victimized as she had been. Her next stop was Lady Pemberton's afternoon salon, where London's most influential women gathered to discuss literature, politics, and society gossip. Eleanor's arrival caused a sensation, not only because of her dramatic transformation, but because word of her broken engagement and mysterious inheritance had already begun to circulate. "Miss Hartwell!" Lady Pemberton exclaimed, her voice pitched high with surprise and curiosity. "How unexpected to see you. I had heard that you were indisposed." "I was travelling," Eleanor replied serenely, accepting a cup of tea with perfect composure. "Taking time to consider my future now that my circumstances have changed so dramatically." The room fell silent as every woman present strained to hear more details about Eleanor's mysterious transformation. She had always been a peripheral figure at these gatherings, tolerated but never truly welcomed. Now, however, she commanded the attention of every person in the room. "We heard about your engagement," Lady Morrison ventured carefully. "Such a pity that it didn't work out." "On the contrary," Eleanor replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I consider it a fortunate escape. I've learned that some men are far more interested in what they believe a woman can provide than in who she actually is." The pointed comment sent ripples of speculation through the assembled ladies. Everyone knew that the Duke of Ashworth had pursued Eleanor with unprecedented determination, only to have the engagement dissolved within days of the announcement. The timing, combined with rumours of Eleanor's inheritance, painted a very unflattering picture of Sebastian's motives. "But surely," Lady Whitmore interjected, the wife of one of Sebastian's gambling companions, "His Grace's feelings were genuine. He seemed quite devoted during your courtship." Eleanor's laugh was soft, but utterly without warmth. "Devotion is such a subjective thing, don't you think? Some men are devoted to a woman's fortune, others to her social connections, still others to the satisfaction of winning a particularly challenging wager." The last comment hit its mark with devastating precision. Lady Whitmore's face went pale as the implications sank in, and Eleanor could see the exact moment when the woman realized that Eleanor knew about her husband's involvement in whatever game had led to Sebastian's pursuit. "A wager?" Lady Pemberton asked, her voice sharp with interest. "Whatever do you mean, Miss Hartwell?" "Oh," Eleanor replied with studied innocence, "I'm sure it's nothing more than idle speculation, though I have heard that some gentlemen find it amusing to make bets about the romantic prospects of women they consider beneath their notice. Quite harmless, I'm sure, unless one happens to be the subject of such entertainment." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and speculative whispers. Eleanor had just confirmed what many had suspected, that her engagement to Sebastian had been the result of some cruel masculine game. The revelation would spread through London society like wildfire, destroying not only Sebastian's reputation but that of his associates as well. As Eleanor took her leave from the salon, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had fired the opening shot in a war that Sebastian and his friends didn't even know they were fighting. But this was only the beginning of her campaign for justice. That evening, as Eleanor sat in her newly appointed study reviewing business reports, she reflected on how completely her life had changed in the space of 2 weeks. She had discovered not only her financial independence, but her own strength and intelligence. She was no longer the overlooked wallflower who had gratefully accepted whatever scraps of attention came her way. Tomorrow, she would begin the next phase of her transformation, establishing her foundation for female artists, expanding her newspaper holdings, and using her influence to champion the causes she believed in. She would show London society that the woman they had dismissed as powerless was now one of the most formidable forces in the city. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. Sebastian Blackwood had thought he was playing a game with a helpless victim, but he had awakened something far more dangerous, a woman who finally understood her own worth and had the means to defend it. The question now was not whether Eleanor would succeed in her transformation, but how thoroughly she would reshape the world that had once rejected her. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Hartwell's dramatic transformation from overlooked wallflower to one of London's most influential women, and the city still buzzed with stories of her remarkable ascension. On this crisp spring morning, she stood in the sunlit conservatory of her newly acquired mansion in Mayfair, a palatial residence that had once belonged to a duke who had gambled away his fortune and been forced to sell to the very woman society had once pitied. The conservatory had been converted into Eleanor's private office, where she conducted the business of her growing empire with the same quiet efficiency that had once made her invisible in drawing rooms. Sunlight streamed through the glass walls, Illuminating the correspondence spread across her mahogany desk, letters from female artists seeking patronage, reports from her newspaper editors, and invitations to social events where her presence was now eagerly sought rather than merely tolerated. "Miss Hartwell," announced her secretary, Miss Caroline Ashford, a sharp-minded young woman Eleanor had rescued from a life of genteel poverty and trained in the intricacies of business management. "Dr. Elias Reed has arrived for your appointment." Eleanor looked up from the architectural plans she had been reviewing, designs for a new women's college she was funding in Yorkshire, and felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that Dr. Reed's visits always brought. Elias Reed was everything Sebastian Blackwood was not: genuinely intelligent rather than merely educated, compassionate rather than calculating, and possessed of the rare quality of seeing people for who they truly were rather than what they could provide. Dr. Reed entered the conservatory with his characteristic easy grace, his warm brown eyes lighting up as they met Eleanor's. At 32, he was a respected physician who had dedicated his practice to serving London's poor, a choice that had earned him the respect of his patients and the disdain of his more profit-minded colleagues. His sandy hair was perpetually dishevelled from his habit of running his hands through it when deep in thought, and his clothes, while well-made, bore the practical simplicity of a man who valued substance over style. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that had first drawn her to him during a chance encounter at a medical charity event 3 months earlier. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything crucial." "Never," Eleanor replied, rising to greet him with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I was just reviewing the plans for the women's medical training program. Your suggestions about the curriculum have been invaluable." And their relationship had begun as a professional collaboration. Eleanor funding a clinic for working women, Elias providing the medical expertise, but had gradually deepened into something far more meaningful. Unlike Sebastian's calculated courtship, Elias's interest in Eleanor had developed naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than deception and manipulation. "I have news," Elias said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "The Royal College of Physicians has agreed to recognize our certification program. Women who complete the training will be qualified to practice as medical assistants throughout England." Eleanor's face lit up with genuine joy. "Elias, that's wonderful. Do you realize what this means? We're not just providing employment, we're opening an entirely new profession for women." More, as they discussed the details of the program, Eleanor marveled at how different this felt from her conversations with Sebastian. Where Sebastian had patronized and condescended, Elias treated her as an equal partner. Where Sebastian had been interested only in her supposed gratitude and submission, Elias valued her intelligence and independence. Their conversation was interrupted by Miss Ashford's return, bearing a silver tray with the morning's most urgent correspondence. Among the letters was one bearing the familiar seal of the London Herald, and Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful as she read its contents. "What is it?" Elias asked, noting the change in her demeanour. "An interesting development," Eleanor replied, passing him the letter. "It seems that Lord Whitmore has been forced to sell his estate to cover gambling debts. The article suggests that his financial difficulties began when certain unwise wagers came to light and damaged his reputation among potential business partners." Elias read the article with growing understanding. Over the past months, Eleanor had shared with him the full story of Sebastian's deception and the cruel bet that had motivated his courtship. Elias had been appalled by the casual cruelty of it all, but had also been amazed by Eleanor's sophisticated response. Rather than seeking crude revenge, Eleanor had used her influence to expose the broader pattern of such behavior among London's elite. Her newspapers had published a series of investigative articles about the culture of gambling and cruelty that pervaded certain aristocratic circles, always careful to present facts rather than accusations, but allowing readers to draw their own conclusions. The impact had been devastating for Sebastian and his associates. Lord Pemberton had been forced to resign from several prestigious clubs when his involvement in betting on women's romantic prospects became public knowledge. Lord Whitmore's business ventures had collapsed as potential partners distanced themselves from his tainted reputation. And Sebastian himself had become a social pariah, his name synonymous with the worst kind of masculine duplicity. "I confess," Elias said, returning the letter, "I'm impressed by the thoroughness of your campaign. You've managed to destroy their reputations without ever directly attacking them. Truth has a way of being its own revenge," Eleanor replied with satisfaction. "I simply ensured that the truth became widely known." But even as she spoke of her former tormentors, Eleanor's mind was focused on the future rather than the past. The woman who had once defined herself by others' opinions now measured her worth by her own accomplishments. She had established 3 schools for working-class girls, funded a dozen female artists whose work was now displayed in galleries across Europe, and used her newspapers to champion causes from women's suffrage to workers' rights. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Elias said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I've been offered a position with a medical mission in India. They're establishing hospitals in remote regions, bringing modern medicine to areas that have never had access to proper healthcare." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work you've always dreamed of doing." "It is," Elias agreed. "But it would mean leaving London for at least 2 years, possibly longer." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "I wanted to know how you felt about that possibility." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had yet voiced. Eleanor knew that Elias was asking about more than just her opinion on his career prospects. Over the past months, their professional partnership had evolved into something deeper, though neither had explicitly acknowledged the growing attraction between them. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that a man should follow his calling wherever it might lead him, even if it means leaving behind someone he's grown quite fond of." Eleanor's breath caught at the gentle admission. "Even then, though—" She paused, gathering her courage. "Though I suppose it would depend on whether that someone might be interested in sharing such an adventure." Elias's face broke into a smile of pure joy. "Eleanor Hartwell, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Eleanor replied, with a confidence that would have amazed her former self, "that I've spent enough time being defined by other people's expectations. If I want to travel to India with a brilliant physician who happens to see me as an equal partner rather than a convenient acquisition, then that's exactly what I'll do." Elias crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking Eleanor's hands in his. "You would really consider leaving all this behind? Your businesses, your social position, your influence?" Eleanor looked around the conservatory, at the evidence of her transformation from powerless victim to influential force for change. Then she looked back at Elias, at the man who had shown her what genuine partnership could look like. "I'm not leaving anything behind," she said firmly. "I'm taking everything I've learned about my own strength and using it in a new arena. Besides," she added with a mischievous smile, "who says I can't run a newspaper empire from India? The world is becoming smaller every day, and I've learned that a woman with determination and resources can accomplish anything she sets her mind to." As Elias pulled her into his arms, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a woman defined by others' perceptions, the plain wallflower, the grateful recipient of masculine attention, the victim of cruel games. Now she was a woman who defined herself, successful businesswoman, social reformer, and partner to a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones drew their attention to the window, where a familiar black carriage was pulling up to Eleanor's front door. Sebastian Blackwood emerged, his once immaculate appearance now showing signs of strain. His clothes, while still expensive, lacked their former perfection, and his handsome face bore the haggard look of a man whose world had crumbled around him. "What do you suppose he wants?" Elias asked, his arms still around Eleanor's waist. Eleanor watched with detached curiosity as Sebastian approached her front door. "I imagine he's finally realized the full extent of what he's lost," she replied. "Not just the bet money, but the chance to align himself with real power and influence." Miss Ashford appeared in the doorway. "Miss Hartwell, the Duke of Ashworth is requesting an audience. Shall I tell him you're not receiving visitors?" Eleanor considered for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I'll see him, but only for a few minutes, and Dr. Reed will remain with me throughout the conversation." As Sebastian was shown into the conservatory, Eleanor was struck by how diminished he seemed. The arrogant confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by the desperate air of a man who had gambled everything and lost. His blue eyes, once so compelling, now held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting debts. "Eleanor," Sebastian began, his voice rough with emotion that might have been genuine, "I had to see you, to try to explain—" "There's nothing to explain, Sebastian," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I understand perfectly what happened between us. You saw an opportunity and took it. When that opportunity disappeared, so did your interest. It's really quite simple." "But that's not true," Sebastian protested, his composure cracking. "Yes, the courtship began as a wager, but my feelings became real. I did fall in love with you, Eleanor. I still love you." Eleanor studied his face with the same detached interest she might show a particularly fascinating specimen in a museum. "Do you, Sebastian? Or do you love what I represent now? The wealth, the influence, the power to restore your reputation?" Sebastian's silence was answer enough. Eleanor felt a profound sense of closure as she realized that the man who had once seemed so magnificent was, in truth, rather small and pathetic. His entire sense of self had been built on others' deference and admiration, and when those were stripped away, there was very little left. "I think," Eleanor said kindly but firmly, "that it's time you left, Sebastian. You have no place in my life now, and frankly, I'm not sure you ever did." As Sebastian was escorted from her home, Eleanor turned back to Elias, who was watching her with undisguised admiration. "You handled that with remarkable grace," he said. "I've learned," Eleanor replied, "that the best revenge is living well." Sebastian thought he was playing a game with a helpless victim, but he actually awakened a woman who was capable of far more than either of them ever imagined. 6 months later, as Eleanor stood on the deck of a ship bound for Bombay, watching the English coastline disappear into the morning mist, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. Beside her, Elias pointed out landmarks and shared his excitement about the work they would do together in India. In her cabin below were the latest reports from her businesses, all thriving under the capable management of the team she had assembled. Eleanor Hartwell had begun her story as a woman defined by others' expectations and limitations. She was ending it as a woman who had learned to define herself, who had discovered that true power came not from others' approval, but from her own sense of worth and purpose. The girl who had once been grateful for any attention had become a woman who commanded respect through her own accomplishments. As the ship carried her toward new adventures and new opportunities to make a difference in the world, Eleanor smiled at the thought of how wrong everyone had been about her. They had seen a plain, powerless wallflower, but she had always been a force of nature waiting for the right moment to bloom. And bloom she had in ways that would have been impossible to imagine when her story began. The question now was not what Eleanor Hartwell might become, but what new world she would conquer with the strength she had finally learned to claim as her own. If this story of transformation and triumph has moved you, I invite you to share it with others who might need to hear Eleanor's message, that true worth comes from within, that every ending can become a new beginning, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from learning to value ourselves as much as we deserve to be valued. Subscribe for more stories of courage, resilience, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle and bloom wherever it's planted.